Good afternoon, good evening, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started at tonight's Teach Climate Network workshop. I'll be turning it over to our presenter, Sarah Slack, in just a minute. But thank you again for joining us. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We are going to be recording tonight's session. And as I mentioned, in just a few minutes, I'll turn it over to Sarah Slack, who will be presenting on inspiring student action projects through urban heat island investigations. This is one of 9 Teach Climate Network workshops throughout the school year. And climate generation is really striving to ignite and sustain the ability of educators, youth, and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. And we hope to do this through 3 overarching strategies, which you can see are overcoming disinformation, centering anti-racism and systemic equity, and really localizing climate change solutions. And so we'll have just one more this school year, and I'll talk a little bit about some upcoming programs at the end. But at this point, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Sarah.
Thanks, Beth. Seth, and good to see you, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I do have the chat up on a second screen, so there will be times when I will ask you to share some ideas and thoughts in the chat, and I'll be checking that as we go. I've also got a couple of Slido polls set up in here, so please feel free to stop me and share your thinking at any point in time, but also please contribute digitally as well if that's easier for you. The link at the bottom of this page is a bit.ly that I set up that'll take you to a folder that contains access to all of the resources that I'll be talking about today. Don't worry, I put this link on almost every single slide, so you'll be able to find it again if you're not typing it in right now. So this slideshow is in there as well. You can open the slides and therefore open any of the links I mentioned to you as I'm talking tonight. There's also copies of some worksheets, of an entire unit plan related to investigating urban heat islands, and some other resources I'll be mentioning tonight. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to get started by just going over a list of things that we're going to be covering tonight. We're going to be talking about some data exploration strategies that I have used with my students and in my classroom, some online resources to support learning and exploring about urban heat islands, some data collection tools and techniques that I've used, and some others that I hope to use in the future, and then some thoughts about what we can do with all the data that we're collecting with our students. So again, the link to all of these resources is that bit.ly that's in the bottom corner of the screen right now, and that link will be displayed on almost every screen, every slide that I'm going to be showing you. So my name is Sarah Slack. I have been teaching in Brooklyn, New York for the past 14 years. And I would love it if those of you who have access to the chat right now could just dump in a link or introduce yourself by sharing your name, the grades you teach, if you are a teacher, if you're in informal education, the range of grades of students who you typically reach through your informal education programs, and what subjects you teach or are most interested in. So I became a New York City public school teacher in 2009 through the New York City Teaching Fellows Program. Most recently, I was teaching science and STEM at a public school in the Borough Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. I've been there for 6 years. During my time in New York City, I was co-chair of the Office of Energy and Sustainability. They added another word to their title, the Climate Education Leadership Team. And I have currently taken a leave of absence from New York City Public Schools to work as a fellow in the Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Program with the USGS in Washington, D.C. And I've had many opportunities to participate in learning that goes beyond the classroom, the National STEM Scholars Program, which I think I saw somebody from the STEM Scholars, my STEM Scholars cohort here. The Citizen Science Teacher Experimentation Program, the Fund for Teachers. I had a grant where I got to drive across the United States to study wolves in natural and artificial settings to develop lessons on genetics, heredity, and evolution. Polar Trek, I got to spend 2 months on an icebreaker off the southwest coast of Antarctica, studying the things that were affecting the melt rate of the Thwaites Glacier. I've gotten funding from Samsung's Solve for Tomorrow grant to help purchase some of the supplies I use in my classroom. And finally, NASA's Climate Change Research Initiative, which takes a teacher and places them on a research team at NASA. So I was working about 5 hours a week. I was getting paid for about 5 hours a week during the school year. And then full time over the summer to both support the research team, but also to develop a curriculum based on the research that they were doing. And that's when I started this work on urban heat islands. So in my STEM class, I teach a lot about climate change, and I always start the year by giving my students this poll question. When will climate change impact life on Earth? And there are 5 choices I let them select from. And I'm actually going to ask you to complete this same poll question on the next slide through Slido. So you can join through either that QR code or by going to slido.com and typing in our poll code, which is 4251537. And I don't want you to answer for yourself because I'm assuming since you've joined this presentation and you're part of Climate Generation, then you know what the correct answer is. But rather, I want you to think about the students that you work with. What do you think the students that you work with would answer? And I'm allowing you to select more than one choice if you think there will be some that are equally likely to appear in your students' answer choices. So the 5 choices are, it will never really impact life on Earth other than maybe a few species in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Would your students say it probably won't impact things in my lifetime, but my future children or grandchildren might see the effects? Would your students say the effects of climate change will likely be seen by the end of my lifetime, so around the year 2100? Would your students say, I think we'll start to see the effects of climate change over the next 10 to 15 years? Or will your students say climate change is already happening? Seth put the Slido code in the chat, so you can check it out there. This is really interesting because the answer choice that got chosen the least often in my STEM class by my students in Borough Park, Brooklyn, was that climate change is already happening. Only about 5% of students over the 4 years I used this poll question responded that climate change was already happening. Now, admittedly, I think, they're middle schoolers. So if I'd asked this question on a particularly hot day, I probably would have gotten a different answer. And in June of our last school year, we had the really bad air quality because of the wildfires in Canada. Something like that might have affected students' choices in this poll. But starting the year with this poll, before we had dug in on any information about climate change, the majority of my students chose maybe their lifetimes or maybe in their future children's lifetimes. So no one thought that it wasn't going to happen ever, but most kids also didn't think that it was already happening. I'm interested, somebody who said that climate change is already happening, if anyone who chose that answer choice as something they believe their students would say, if you could just jump on and tell us a little bit about your students, I'd love to hear who you're representing when you selected that answer. I see we've got teachers from California,
I can
from
speak.
Minnesota.
Oh,
Hi, other Sarah. What do you think?
hi. I'm speaking of my future students that I will be teaching. I'll be teaching middle school science next year at a new school. But I've already had contact with middle school students there a little bit this year, and I would say that the reason that my students would say that climate change is already happening is because they are affected by it quite a bit with air quality. They all live and heat islands, and they're all experiencing the effects of it this year. And it's just something that, some of these kids are, just 12 years old, but they're very, very aware of it and pretty depressed about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Sarah, that's interesting, and it connects well to the next slide. So I'm going to move on from this poll to these 5 facts, 10 words that were put out by the Yale program on climate change communication. And of all those facts, I really try to focus on that last one, that there's hope. Because when you're working with middle school, elementary school, high school students, this global climate catastrophe that's facing them is so overwhelming, and also something that they didn't necessarily have a lot of a role in contributing to. Instead, it's this thing that people of my generation are dumping in their lap and saying, good luck, I hope you can fix it. So experts agree it's real, it's bad, it's us, but there's hope. And I love this line from a poem by Cassandra Bosquet, Dear Human at the Edge of Time, which is the name of the poem. The edge is not the end, we still have time to try. And that's one of the things I really like about urban heat island investigations. We are not trying to solve the climate crisis with this project. Instead, we're looking at the places that students know the best, the places that they care about, and trying to figure out how to protect that place and those people who use that place from the effects of extreme heat. I often use the example of this Hallmark poem about a starfish. A kid was walking down the beach and he was picking up starfish that had been stranded by the high tide and chucking them back into the water. And this guy walks up to him and is like, what are you doing, kid? There's so many starfish on the beach, you'll never be able to make a difference. And the kid picks up another starfish, throws it in the water, and he says, well, I made a difference to that one. And that's what this project is about. We're really trying to find ways to help kids protect the people and the places that they know about. So I have 2 examples now of strategies I use and I rely on frequently to look at data with students. One is from My NASA Data. They have literacy cubes where they actually have a template so you can cut out and glue together these dice that have different choices on them. And students will roll a die, they'll figure out what questions they are responsible for answering about a map or a graph or a data set. Some things I really like about this is that they have them leveled. So each set of questions appears at 4 different levels and a 5th level for L's. And kids have some choice in which questions they answer. You have some choice as well, because not every question will apply to every data set. So there is a link here. Any of these can be printed as a Google form. All of the data sets are available for you to use. We are going to come back to this on a later slide. Another strategy I really like for examining data with students comes from the New York Times. And they actually have 2 versions of questions for this. One is what's going on in this picture, and the other is what's going on in this graph. And so we're going to start with this picture, which is not from the New York Times, but how this activity works is that the Times posts a photograph without context and asks students these 3 questions. What is going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? And students respond to these questions for about the window of opportunity is open for, I think it's 4 days. And then on the 5th day, the Times posts the actual story that goes along with the picture that they shared. So I have a picture here for you. And again, I would encourage you to unmute yourself or type your response in the chat. What's going on in this picture? And if you write something, I'm going to follow up with, what do you see that makes you say that? So respond to both questions at once or expect a follow-up from me. Whoops, sorry, everyone. It keeps going. I'll go back. So again, the question is, what's going on in this picture? And what do you see that makes you say that? Seth Spencer says an island nation. Seth, what do you see that makes you think this is an island nation?
I'm using my some knowledge of national flags, and also it looks very flat um, behind the people. And I've seen
Mhm.
a similar image as well.
Yeah. So this comes from a fantastic website called 20 Climate Photographs That Changed the World. And a great way to get your kids started on an exploration of climate change at a more global scale is to look at some of these pictures, but they also show people just struggling with those local impacts of climate change. So again, you don't want to overwhelm or depress your students, but this is a neat and engaging way to get kids thinking about the effects of climate change on people all around the world. So two people in the water, the podium. A lot of people have said they feel the podium makes them think this is somebody official. And Seth, I actually am going to maybe mess it up. So correct me if I'm wrong if you know the right answer. But I believe this is from the UN, not the most recent UN meeting, but this was somebody from Tuvalu presenting at a recent COP climate UN climate meeting. But if you want to correct me, you can just go to 20 Climate Photographs That Changed the World and find out more. So here is my, whoops, and somehow I did it without intending to. So I am attempting to use the Slido to display the slides. And because of that, it is occasionally, it seems like I can't go back the way that I am used to. So here we go. Now here's a graph. So examining data with students again, these are the New York Times questions for what's going on in this graph. They ask students, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What impact does this have on you and your community? And then what's going on in this graph? They challenge students to write a catchy headline that captures the graph's main idea. So you can see there's information provided to students in the graph. They don't leave the axes blank. And there are some labels here, but they want students to think about the context for this graph. What is the meaning? And I really love that third question. What impact does this have on you and your community? So we've got people from Minnesota on this call tonight. And sea level rise, this is global temperature. Equally interesting graph about sea level showing an alarming trend for 2023 and 2024. Anyway, both of these sets of questions and this strategy gets kids to look closely at data. A lot of the work that we're doing related to urban heat islands is going to ask students to look at and to work with data. So having them feel comfortable interpreting a graph, interpreting a data set is a really important component of this work. And it's great to start with pictures and build to graphs. And now I've got some images that include both data and pictures in the same thing. So I'm going to ask you what's going on in these pictures, but I'm using the graph questions. So what do you notice? What do you wonder? What impact does this have on you and your community? What do you think is going on in these images? Again, anything you want to share in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know. What do you notice about these sets? There's two sets of pictures here. They were all taken on the same day in almost the exact same location. What do you notice? What do you wonder? The pavement is a lot hotter than green spaces. You're right, Josh. So that the legend is on the side of the images on the left hand. And you can see that some of the pavement in one of those pictures looks to be as hot as 153 degrees. Whereas the picture that shows a much shadier area also has much cooler temperatures, including the average temperature of that image, 92.5 degrees in the lower picture, 137 degrees Fahrenheit in the upper one. So much cooler where there's green spaces, much cooler in the shade. Great observations. And Delia says she hates walking places without shade. It makes such a difference to have shady areas in your community as you're moving around. Yep. And neither of these pictures has anyone outside enjoying the outdoor environment. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great. Yeah, my students mostly walk to school. And so I always wonder how they experience that environment. And actually, one of the things that has my students most curious is that I get to sometimes bring my dogs to school with me. And they want to know what the environment is like for my little dog who is so close to the ground. When they see something like this, they want to know how hot is it in little Elsie's world. So urban heat islands are a phenomenon in which urban areas have higher average temperatures than nearby less developed areas. And a lot of this is a result of those images you just saw, because so many of the surfaces in urban areas heat up more in the sun and then hold on to that heat for longer. They are hotter during the day and they don't cool off as much as at night. So average temperatures in an urban area or within an urban heat island can be as much as 10 degrees Celsius higher than less developed areas. There are plenty of resources online. If you live in an urban area, this is the 50 major cities in the United States, how much hotter the urban environment is in those 50 urban areas than it is in surrounding less developed areas. In some places, tall buildings provide shade and actually help to cool off some pretty hot parts of the country. So that's what's happening in Las Vegas and Albuquerque. Those urban areas actually can be cooler than the surrounding environment because open desert with dark colored sand can get even hotter than a city area in those places. A couple of links here can help you further explore the urban heat island effect. And this is when it's a real bummer that we're sitting here talking through a computer screen and not all in a classroom together. Because then I showed this graph, which shows the albedo of common surfaces, how much light they absorb versus how much they reflect. We make some hypotheses about what it would be like outside. We grab our infrared surface thermometers and we head out to collect some temperature data. So whenever I do this with my students, I go through some really clear rules and protocols for using infrared surface thermometers. And the main one that I have for my students is a reminder that it is a tool and not a toy, and it should never be pointed at any humans. Of course, we used something similar to an infrared surface thermometer to take forehead temperatures during COVID. These are not designed for human use. So I remind them that I don't want them pointing it at other humans. There is a laser pointer on this. It probably wouldn't do any permanent damage to students. What I really don't want is people driving by my school, seeing a teacher outside and a bunch of kids pointing guns at each other, which is a lot what this looks like. So constant reminders that it is a tool, not a toy. I bring my students back inside the first time I see a student pointing it at another student, and that pretty much curtails the behavior almost instantly. These are relatively affordable. You get them on Amazon, usually for $18. There's different versions, but know that if you have two different color schemes on your thermometers, there are going to be arguments between students because they constantly feel that one is better than the other. I developed this data sheet for my students where we take some basic observations about the weather on that day, and then we record the temperature of pavement in the sun and in the shade, cement in the sun and shade, dirt. And we actually have to work a little bit to find any grass around our school. My students have to leave our schoolyard and go over to a neighboring apartment building where there is a small patch of grass in front of it. They are then allowed to collect surface temperature data on some other things that they're interested in. This often includes tree trunks, white cars, black cars, green cars, blue cars, the garbage can, the picnic tables, the metal fencing that surrounds our schoolyard. There are so many things that they're curious about. And this is where your investigation of urban heat islands can end, because when students measure temperatures like this, they are almost immediately indignant and inspired to find out more. When we do this, we find that the You know what? I'm going to ask you to guess first. Here's a grassy surface in the shade and a grassy surface in the sun on this day with temperatures in the high 70s. We found that our grassy surface was about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the sun, I think it's 91. I can't see what it says behind your little faces in my screen. 91 degrees Fahrenheit is what we found with my students. So now, hopefully this will still work as a Slido poll, even though I left and came back in. Here's some pavement, some asphalt, same day, same location. What do you think we're gonna find for the temperature of the asphalt in the shade versus the asphalt in the sun? And if you did open the slideshow and you skipped ahead to the next slide, you already know the answer, so don't ruin it for the rest of us. Join slido.com, and this time the code is 4251537. Can you give me two temperatures with a versus between them? That's the asphalt in the shade versus the asphalt in the sun. And if you don't want to do it on Slido, you can oh no! You can feel free to do it right in the chat as well. So again, the code is 4251, 80 versus 110, 95 versus 130, sun 101, shade 89. We're giving our temperature readings in Fahrenheit, which is how I understand them, having been raised in the 80s. 75 versus 110. I feel like somebody peaked. Great guesses, you guys. This was taken in early May in Brooklyn. Love the guesses. Going to keep going just in the interest of time. Sorry to ruin it for so many of you. The temperature of the asphalt in the shade was 77 degrees. And honestly, I think that this one, the asphalt had been shaded all day. So sun had not touched the asphalt yet that day. And so the temperature was no different from the grass. But you can see in the sun, it had warmed up to 115 degrees. And so our pavement is getting much, much hotter than our grass, even when both are in full sun. There are lots of cool ways to collect temperature data and ways to make that data meaningful to your students. So we went outside and measured the temperatures of asphalt, which is our schoolyard where our kids are sent out to play during recess, and the adjacent cement parking lot where our administrators can put their cars during the day. And they found the temperatures of the asphalt were 20 degrees higher than that cement parking lot, and they were immediately indignant. And so I didn't need to do anything else to inspire students to want to take action to fix this situation. And they started coming up with solutions. What if we paint the asphalt? What if we could put more trees in? Why isn't there grass here? All of those things my students asked without any context for why we were out there measuring temperatures. So here's a project, an experiment a group of students set up. They painted these rainbow colored circles on our asphalt schoolyard and measured the temperatures of those circles whenever we went outside to see how color affected surface temperature. Some other ideas would be to partner with another school that's also collecting data. I had my students tape those data sheets right into their notebooks, so we had a record of how weather had changed and how surface temperatures had changed over the course of the whole school year. We started in the fall and we kept going outside the following spring into June. New York City schools don't let out until the end of June, so we had a lot of time to collect data. I'll keep going with some of these other bullet points and further examples as we continue through these slideshows. But there are a lot of other really cool ways to get your students involved in data collection. One is to use devices that have been developed by some guys at NASA. They created these devices that they call Stella. And Stella is definitely an acronym that stands for something. I don't know what that is right now, but you can click on that link and find out for yourself what all the letters in Stella mean. These are two Stella devices. Both of these could easily be built by students with some basic engineering skills. They involve Arduinos, and so there's some programming that's involved, but that code has already been written by these researchers at NASA who've been working on this project. There's some 3D printing that is involved, but the STL files for these 3D prints have already been created for you. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just tape some stuff to a ruler and head out in the field and collect a bunch of data. So these allow you not only to measure surface temperature, but you could measure light intensity. You could measure, there's a sensor that can measure particulate matter. There's a more expensive sensor that can measure carbon dioxide levels in the air wherever you're measuring this. But your students could choose which sensors they wanted to include in the array. You can assemble this, and now your students have a pretty fancy piece of equipment, costs less than $200. And if you need funding to help you pay for this, I would suggest the Y Lacey's grant, which is also linked over there in the text of this slide, as a way to get money for your students to go out and collect that environmental data around your schoolyard, but also to provide them the opportunity to do some of those engineering skills, build some of those engineering skills that I feel often get overlooked in STEAM. Next is a device called the Aaron Terra Rover. This is another NASA program. This is me trying to drive, I'm trying to drive the Terra Rover in a straight line. So observe my skills. This was probably after 15 minutes outside practicing. Remote control, doing a great job. But one thing this does demonstrate, let's pretend this was my goal, this thing will drive right across the grass as well. And everywhere it goes is collecting air temperature data, light intensity data, relative humidity, and surface temperature. So if I'm driving this across the grass as well as across this sidewalk, I'm collecting surface temperature data. This one has a geolocator built into it, so you're also getting GPS data. So each of your data points are geolocated. You can map this data after you collect it, and a kid can figure out how to drive this thing in less than 10 seconds. So the Aaron program, this is called the Terra Rover. They actually have 3 different data collecting systems. They have kites, they have the water and land-based Terra Rovers. They are holding trainings, and when they hold a training, it is virtual. It is a few hours long over a couple of days, and they send you the kite. This one is for their kite. Unfortunately, the Terra Rover training application date has already closed, but you can apply to join their kite program. They will send you all the materials, train you how to use it, train you how to use the data that you've collected as a result of this. The program is in mid-July, so a couple of days break from your summer vacation to learn how to use that kite, and then you're part of this community. They continue to have professional development activities where you can learn more and more about the kites and the other equipment that they use. So that is all just about urban heat islands. But when we start to dig in further, I think this is when it gets even more interesting for me and for my students. And that is that a city like New York doesn't have just one urban heat island. Temperature varies between communities from block to block in New York City, depending on some of the neighborhood characteristics. So those of you who are familiar with New York City know that there are 5 boroughs that make up the city, and one of those things is not like the others. And that thing is Staten Island. In so many ways, Staten Island is different than the rest of New York City. One of those ways is that it has a lot more green space. So the green shows the variation in vegetation from sparse to dense. And you can see that Staten Island in general has much more vegetation than most of the Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn. You can clearly see Central Park in the center of Manhattan. You can see Prospect Park and the graveyard. My school's right next to it, and I'm blanking on the name of it. But here's Central Park, here's Prospect Park, and you can see how those things have an effect on temperature in New York City. The temperatures in Central Park are cooler than the temperatures in the rest of Manhattan. The temperatures in Prospect Park are cooler than they are in most other places in Brooklyn. So we can dig in on this even more, and there's a lot of great resources online that can help your students better understand what has created these differences. And one of the main things were racist housing policies. A lot of neighborhoods were identified as they were ranked A, B, C, and D. D neighborhoods were considered dangerous, and therefore people didn't want to invest and offer loans to folks who wanted to live in those areas, which became known as red-lined communities. So red lines were literally drawn around these areas on a map. It was really hard to get a loan if you wanted to buy a house in those areas, and they frequently were places where cities did not invest much effort in maintaining or beautifying or protecting those neighborhoods. So the screen recording that I'm showing you now is from a New York Times story. There is a long written story after this that can be really interesting for your students to read, but I love this graphic that as you scroll through it, you can see how parts of Richmond, Virginia are much hotter than others. These areas were formerly red-lined areas in Richmond, Virginia. So a great article and a great way to get started in these discussions about redlining. I'm now going to show you 4 different resources and ask you to spend a few minutes exploring one of them. So you've got some choices to make here, everybody. I'll tell you what each resource is, and then give you a QR code that would take you directly to any of those resources. If you don't want to use a QR code, remember that all the links in this slide presentation are live. So join the slide presentation and click on the link of the resource you want to go to. Climate Central has analyzed 44 major US cities that together account for about 1/4 of the population of the United States, and looked at where people in those cities live. And so the percentage of people living in those cities who are exposed to areas that are higher than the average temperature for the city. So, or sorry, not for the city, that have an urban heat island effect of 8 degrees, 10 degrees, 12 degrees. Looking at this data set is complex, and that's why it's such a cool time to use the NASA, My NASA data cubes to get kids to look in at this data closely, explore what they're seeing a little bit more carefully. If you don't want to do that, if you just want to look at how different parts of the city, based on census tracts, are different from each other, this same website, Climate Central, has each of the 44 cities that they profile broken down into an image like this that says how many people in that city are exposed to higher temperatures, excessively higher temperatures, as a result of the urban heat islands. If you haven't used Climate Central, their graphs are usually really interesting. They've got data presented in a number of different ways that makes it easy for students to explore it and learn from it. The next potential website for you to check out is Urban Heat Island Severity for US cities. This will take you to an ArcGIS online map that was created by the Trust for Public Land. And this is using data from the summers of 2019 and 2020 from Landsat 8, one of the NASA/USGS satellites that has the highest resolution data. And you can zoom in really closely on this one and get an idea of what parts of the cities, and this covers way more cities than the Climate Central data does, what points in those cities are getting hotter than others. The next data set looks at both redlining and temperature. It also gives you information about the percent impervious surface in an area and percent tree cover and percent minority of the population. So you can click on any of the areas that were designated as actually A, B, C, or D. So you can click on redlined areas or other parts of the city and find out those 4 categories for each of these places. This is another ArcGIS. This one was created, I think it's like the Science Museum of Richmond. I know Jeremy Hoffman was really involved in creating this data set and these maps. So this one has that redlining information. If your students want to explore this as from an environmental justice lens, this is a great place to start. And then the last data set I'm going to show you is brand new. It just came out in the middle of February. They took Landsat data and they finally made it so easy to use that even my middle school students can do it. So this is called the Landsat Explorer app. And if you follow the link that's here or on the QR code slide that I'm going to show you in just a minute, up here you can type in any address that you're interested in. And then we're going to be looking at the surface temperature data, which down here under renderer, that will show you the data specific to our interest. And now I'm just going to quick show you a little video of how you can set some of the parameters. First, you'll type in an address into that search bar in the top corner. You can use a zip code. You can use a specific street address. You can type in the name of an entire city. It will then zoom to that city. If find a scene isn't highlighted, you need to click on find a scene towards the bottom of the screen, and then set your cloud cover so that you're only looking at data that was collected on days when the cloud cover was less than 10%. You'll notice that that's going to limit the data sets that are available to you, but choose a date in the summer and then click on that date. And if you have to click surface temperature again, you can to display surface temperature data. This is for my school's zip code in Brooklyn, New York. You can then click on any point in that map and it will tell you the estimated surface temperature for that point from that date when Landsat collected data. So I'm going to advance to the next slide, but I'll be here to answer questions if you are having trouble. Here are the 4 resources I just mentioned. Climate Central's Urban Heat Hotspots, which has that really cool data table, as well as the pictures of cities divided up into census blocks. The ArcGIS Urban Heat Island Severity for US cities that had the pink colors. You can zoom in really closely on those cities and look at differences in temperature. The one that has the connection to redlining and exposure to urban heat islands. And then the Landsat Explorer, which has data for your community from any place you're interested in. I tried to show my students Quito, Ecuador. Quito, Ecuador has not had a single day with less than 10% cloud cover in the entire year 2023. So there are 0 data sets with 10% cloud cover or less for Quito, Ecuador from 2023, which we'll get back to the challenges of using satellites. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. I'd love for you to explore one of these resources just a little bit. Think about how you could use it in your classroom. And then there's going to be a Slido where I just love your feedback in a short word or phrase, your observations on what you observed after you take a minute to check out one of these. 6:44, 6 minutes. See you soon. I'm going to pop ahead, grab the Slido code, put it in the chat. Same one, 4251537. So after you've observed, please go back to Slido. I'm going to switch to the next slide, everyone.
Can I ask something about the Landsat Explorer? Like
Yes.
where is the explanation what the colors exactly mean? I wasn't able to find that yet.
Oh, great question. I don't know if there is a I'm trying to think about this without seeing it because I have my
Okay.
screen on this, but
I just noticed like
Let me-
I'm looking at my hometown in Germany and like it's a lot of pink and green, but like if I click into it, it will always say 35 degrees Celsius, and it doesn't matter whether I click on green or not. So I was trying to figure out, obviously you can't get every single point, but
you should though. There should be every single point. Are you on the surface temperature renderer? Did
let's
you click
see.
on that in the
I'm on
lower
Explore, find a scene in selection,
Yep.
and that's all I can actually see. I mean, like I'm sharing this with the Zoom, so that always kind of limits one in
Yeah.
what you can actually do.
Let me keep going and then I'll circle back to you and see if I can help you.
I mean, it's not
so
that
you can look at
important.
that data. Okay.
It's not that
I
important.
mean,
I was just interested in like, trying to, what am I actually seeing here? Like, what you're supposed to be asking, but I'm not quite sure what I'm seeing.
okay. Thanks guys for your contributions to the Slido poll. I love to hear that you think it's accessible for students. That was one thing, especially with the new Landsat Explorer, that finally all this data is just there for them. But I don't want our students to be left thinking that there's not a role for them in understanding how urban heat islands are affecting the places closest to them. Like I mentioned in Quito, Ecuador, there would be no data if we were looking for days when there was not a lot of cloud cover. Landsat satellites, there's 2 of them up there now. They are offset so that they are in opposite cycles, but that still means that they're only passing over New York City once every 8 days. And so that's a lot of time when there's no satellite data telling us what the hottest places in Brooklyn are. There's also real immediate things that we can do when we're out there noticing and observing the temperatures. If you find, for example, a bus stop where there is just uncomfortably or dangerously high temperatures, that could be a place where you can encourage the city to plant a tree or to make some effort to better protect people who use that bus stop on a regular basis. So this was put together by Andy Henry, who worked for Aaron the Terra Rover and Kite organization. And number one shows a satellite image of Atlanta, Georgia. And he zoomed in on that so you could see the pixels of data that are part of a satellite image, and then further zoomed in. So we're looking at a single pixel. But under that pixel, there's actually a massive amount of variation in temperature. This temperature data was collected by driving a Terra Rover around the parking lot, and having all of those data points reveal that there's pretty significant variation in this location. So if your students wanted to propose improvements to your schoolyard or to a particular part of your city where people might be more at risk, they can use temperature data that they've created to justify the need for mitigation. Another resource that can provide you and your students with the vast amount of data is the EJ Screen. So EJ Screen was put out by the EPA, and it combines a number of pollution indices with other socioeconomic indicators. Again, only for the United States, but you can click on any location in the United States and find out the relationship between some of these pollution and sources and other environmental justice indices and socioeconomic indicators. If you go to this website and you click on climate change data, it does not have any temperature data. All their climate change data is related to sea level rise, and it might mostly be sea level rise and flood risk. So if you're interested in seeing the combination of environmental justice data and temperature data, your students could be actively involved in that process and use that to justify making improvements to places in their community. One last thing I work on with my students is to combine art and data. So these are two examples of that, of finding visual ways to describe or show information about urban heat islands. The mural on the in the lower image is on a building in Richmond, Virginia. It was painted by a student at Virginia Commonwealth University. I apologize that this is a screenshot, so the two links under these images are not live links. But if you go to the lesson that's linked in the unit plan, you will be able to get to the website that presents both of these. So encourage your students to show what they know in a creative way, to look at that temperature data and use it to create a heat map of your community or the area right around your school. Use it to create I skipped that slide, an annotated drawing which combines data and imagery to create a really informative message about a place. I've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd love to take some time to answer any questions you might have, but I would just like to mention that there are some additional links here of resources that I've used. The EPA's website about measuring urban heat islands might help more advanced students think of a protocol for going out and collecting data that could have real meaning to city planners. They also have their Reducing Urban Heat Islands Compendium of Strategies, which talks about how trees or cool pavement or cool roofs or green roofs can all make a difference to the urban heat island effect in your community. So if you want your students to actually take those action projects, try out an experiment, even if it's as simple as just painting the circles on the pavement the way my students did, and collect data to find out what would be the coolest color to paint our schoolyard. Data like that, experiments like that, that your students design and carry out related to surface temperature are perfect for the Globe International Virtual Student Symposium. So if you're looking to get your students involved in data projects and action projects that they could present and share with kids from all around the world, I would recommend looking at the Globe International Virtual Science Symposium, Student Symposium. So now, with 4 minutes left, I'd love to take any questions you might have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just really encourage you to type questions in the chat or unmute yourselves and ask.
Hi, I'm just wondering if folks have heard of the Tulip Test Garden project through Journey North.
I haven't, but I just saw you posted about it in the chat. I'm so excited. Tell us more.
So it shows what I like to call natural climate across North America. People plant the same type of tulips in Texas and in Minnesota and in Alaska and in Canada. And then people post two data points, just when they emerge and when they bloom, and they call it the green wave and then the red wave. You can do this with first graders, you can do it with seniors in high school, and you can peel apart why, these things are happening when they're happening. And there's trends that you can see, and then there's interruptions to those trends, which are interesting. But what I've done in St. Paul Public Schools with a collective of 25 different teachers at 25 different school sites is that in St. Paul Public Schools, we're an urban school district, they plant those same tulips there. And then I run an environmental learning center that's part of St. Paul Public Schools, but it's in an ex-urban area, just 20 miles outside of the city. And we just planted them again for the 7th year, and we plant about 1,000 tulips. So some good data points. And the urban tulips came up a full 8 days earlier
Wow.
so far. And right now, the average bloom date, they haven't all bloomed yet, but they're blooming right now. And the average bloom date in the city is April 8th. And we're now at April 17th, and they still have not bloomed at Belwyn yet. Which is where I
Wow.
and that's the ex-urban area. So it's a really simple onion layer thing where you can talk to first graders. You can ask them about why they think they might have bloomed earlier in the city versus outside of the city. And you can talk to first graders about climate change and the urban heat island effect. You can talk to seniors in high school, and you can always just stop when the kids are ready to be done. You can just point at pretty tulips. But so it's a really fun, engaging thing for whatever grade level you're working with. And you just need one site that's in an urban area and one site that's in an ex-urban area, somewhere around the same latitude, and it works pretty well.
Yeah, we could use Staten Island. Has anyone, I'm typing it because I was typing in, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Has anyone heard of, I think it's called the phenological gardens, where it's the same idea. I hadn't heard tulips, but a shrub or something else, and you're planting them in two different areas and just looking for the bud date, I think. But that tulips would be so much more fun because when they first come up from the ground, it's such a neat sign of spring. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, in our 7th year now, we've
And
kind of
go
matriculated
ahead.
up some that have been doing more. So we planted pollination stations. So we're doing the same phenological study now, but with 14 different
Mhm,
species rather than just one. But the tulip is a
mhm.
real easy, it's a school
Yeah,
year, no summer care. You can forget about it over the summer.
yeah, nice. Thanks. Great idea. Anyone else have anything to share? Any additional resources? It sounds like maybe if you try the Landsat with full screen, that might work out a little bit better, I hope. And I think EJ Screen, I was amazed by the amount of data that EJ Screen makes available to everybody. Um, I used it with a class of high school students that I work with once a week, and they have an hour and 40-minute class, and I had a whole series of activities planned for them, and we never made it past exploring EJ Screen because there was just so much information in there that they were really interested in. Yep, sorry everybody. I went too long. I talked too much. Seth reminds us it's okay to just, cut me off now. But I'll stick around for a couple of minutes if anyone does have any questions, if you noticed any resources weren't working, or if you want to clarify on how to use something, I'll be here. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending the presentation tonight. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you got some resources that you'll be able to use in your classrooms and beyond. Thanks.